if we are going to respond appropriately to the ecological crisis, or for that matter, the rest of what we're now calling the polycrisis, right? It's important to understand them. And in order to understand them, it's also really valuable if we have a sense of where they come from, their origins, the roots of the ecological crisis, etc. And this is one of those places where I think Buddhism can be very helpful, and it is important to distinguish the Buddhist approach from, say, the Abrahamic theistic approach. For Christianity, for example, the fundamental issue is good versus evil, right? God tells us how to live, and we get in trouble if we disobey him. From a Buddhist perspective, though, this duality of good and evil is a pretty good example of what's sometimes called dualistic thinking or bipolar thinking. That is to say, a kind of conceptual duality where the meaning of each is dependent on the other. The meaning of each is the negation of the other. So we don't know what's good until we know what's evil. We don't know what's evil until we know what's good. And a lot of the issue involves the struggle between them, to the point where sometimes we understand that the best way to feel good is to be fighting against the evil, which historically has caused all kinds of problems. You think about Inquisition, crusades, heresy and witchcraft trials, and so forth. Pascal, the French philosopher, said, "Men never do evil so fully and so happily as when they do it for the sake of their conscience, when they think they are serving the good by doing it." The Buddhist approach is quite different, right? It's not so much good and evil, although, of course, there's a big role for morality. But fundamentally, Buddhism, there's something more cognitive. It's fundamentally ignorance versus awakening, or delusion versus wisdom. There's something that we need to wake up to, something that we need to realize. So we can say that for Buddhism, the fundamental problem, it's not evil, it's ignorance. We're ignorant of our true nature, we're ignorant of the true nature of the world. And our path is about waking up from that ignorance. But when we look at how that ignorance manifests in the world, there's another important Buddhist teaching, which I love. It's a teaching that we all know or all familiar with, but I think we tend to take it for granted, and we don't realize how important or how profound it is. What I'm referring to, of course, is what's sometimes called the three poisons, or the three fires, or sometimes the three unwholesome roots, akusala mula. Now, I'm assuming everyone is familiar with these. Can anyone remind me what they are? Okay, greed for sure. Anger, aversion, ill will, that's the word I usually use. And the third one, delusion, something to do with thinking, right. I mean, I think pretty much we all hear this teaching a lot, but I don't think we realize how important it is. But let me ask you first, why are there three roots of evil, or unwholesome roots, three poisons? Why three? Why not 5 or 10? That's a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer, but it's something worth thinking about, isn't it? And I think it's significant, well, I'm sure it's significant, for example, that in the Bhagavad Gita, it talks about 3 different paths to God. And not only that, if you go back to Plato, in his dialogues, he talks about the tripartite, 3-part sense of the self. Or basically what he's saying is that we, as human beings, there are 3 parts to us. He distinguishes, well, first of all, he uses the analogy of a chariot with the horses and the charioteer. And he says, well, the chariot is like our bodies. And the horses are like the passions. And the charioteer is the rational mind. And of course, for Plato, the philosopher, it's really important that the rational mind control the other 2. Otherwise, all kinds of problems occur. And that's also the case in his state. When he talks about his ideal state, he also talks about different classes of people. You know, you have the warriors, passionate. You have the workers and the merchants. You know, they're compared to the body, but they like money. And then finally, the philosopher kings, the ones who are truly wise, and they are the ones who should run things, control the state. Anyway, that's his theory. Now, why am I going into this? Well, I think it's saying something really important about who we are and how it is that we're constructed. We see this in the Bhagavad Gita. I already mentioned that it talks about different paths to God, right? Bhakti Yoga, which is the path of devotion. Karma Yoga, which is the path of action. The word karma literally means action. And Jnana Yoga, which is the path of wisdom or the path of meditation. Again, quite striking, these 3 different parts. And I think we can see, you know, they are corresponding to different aspects of us. What the Gita is saying, and it's interesting that some people think the Gita was written in response to the effect of Buddhism on India, that Buddhism was attracting a lot of the young men, they were joining the monastic order, and it was causing some problems in society. And anyway, some scholars think the Gita, as part of this longer epic, the Mahabharata, it was composed to emphasize, hey, you don't have to become a monastic to follow a spiritual path. There's different paths for different types of people at different stages in their lives. So, for example, there's Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion, the path of love. Strictly speaking, in the Gita it refers to love of Krishna, but Krishna is the big God who sort of takes form as everyone and everything. In other words, we could understand the path of bhakti as sort of purifying the emotional center. It's not simply a matter of loving God, but loving all of God's creation. So it means we'd sort of purify ourselves of all of our negativity, somebody who's on this path. And likewise, well, as Buddhist practitioners, we're most familiar with the path of wisdom, the path of meditation, which works on the intellectual center. I don't know that I need to say anything more about that. But the other interesting one, karma yoga, literally the path of action, which is when one basically does one's duty. In the Gita, you're stationed according to how you're born and so forth. You do your duty, but without attachment to results, which in fact became a very important part of the Bodhisattva path, right? We do the best we can without attachment to results, without knowing whether what we do will make any difference. And if you think about that, you can see how each of those paths works on one of those different centers, right? For example, the karma yoga path, if what you're doing is unattached to the results, well, that's going to really cut into greed, isn't it? It's going to challenge our greed if what we're doing is what we need to do, not for all the stuff we're going to get from it. The path of Bhakti Yoga will be really good for purifying our emotional life, as we said. And then the path of meditation, well, that we're pretty much familiar with. It's dealing with delusions, especially the delusion of a separate self. And that you can say that purifies the mind, right? So all of that exposition, and I personally think it's quite fascinating in a way, but I think it does give us important insight into why, Buddhism talks about these three poisons, or sometimes these three fires, that they point to different aspects, such that we're different. Some people will have more of a problem with one rather than the other. And it's interesting, if you look at, say, East Asian Buddhism, the Buddhism of China, Korea, Japan, for example, although we're most familiar with Zen, actually that's a kind of small minority. By far the most influential forms of East Asian Buddhism are what you could call devotional Buddhism, right? In Japan, what do we say? Jodoshu and Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, where you basically, you are basically working on the emotional, and you are developing the love side of things, right? But let's come back after that little excursion. Let's come back to this question of the three poisons. Why or how are they important in helping us understand the particular kind of situation we're in today? First of all, we need to realize that traditionally Buddhism has focused on understanding them in individual terms. That is to say, until very recently, the greed, ill will, and delusion that I need to worry about is my own. That's been the emphasis on the Buddhist path. Our practice helps us see the ways in which each of us is greedy, right? Each of us has ill will. I'm reminded of a Buddhist cartoon I saw here, which comes up. It's a cartoon of some young Buddhist novices listening to the Buddha. See if I can get this right. What does the Buddha say about anger and hatred? So the Buddha is saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, right? That's a pretty good metaphor. But one of the novices is taking notes, and he writes down, Buddha says, make sure you give the poison to the other guy. Maybe we shouldn't give it to either one, right? So just as we need traditionally to focus on our own greed, ill will, and delusion, as in our own meditations, that's been a really important part of the path. And now we find ourselves in a new situation where, as Chomsky says, right, this is the most dangerous time in human history due to the ecological crisis, the danger of nuclear war, and the rise of authoritarianism. And when we try to understand those, this is where I think Buddhism can be so helpful here. It seems to me we can explain a lot, and sometimes I think we can explain everything by saying the cause is the fact that, or at least The form that the problem is taking is that each of these three poisons has become institutionalized. They're not individual anymore. They've taken not only a collective form, but that collective form has taken on a life of its own. It's not simply that certain people are working together, but the form that it takes tends to control and manipulate the people that are part of it, right? I think you can see where I'm going with this, but I think it's important. For example, collective greed. Well, if greed means you never have enough, you always want more, I think that's a pretty good statement about our present economic system. Present, what do we call it? Corporate consumer capitalism. On the individual level, we have some insight that greed is not a good thing. But when it's institutionalized, what happens? People like Elon Musk become cultural heroes. And if you think about corporations, they're never profitable enough. The market share is never big enough. They always want more. The stock prices on Wall Street, it's never high enough. You can always have more, and the goal of a good manager of a good corporation is to keep growing. But the question, why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? Especially on a planet that doesn't grow. Here I'm reminded of Naomi Klein, who makes the point that today you can understand the ecological crisis as this tension, this clash between two systems. On the one hand, this economic system that has to keep growing if it's not going to collapse. And on the other hand, the biosphere, which does not grow in significant amounts. It seems to me, if you have an economic system that needs to grow, as ours does, it always wants to extract more resources to increase its profitability, sooner or later you're going to have a clash with the biosphere, and that's the ecological crisis, and it's now. And I think it's important not to reduce it to, say, individually greedy people, although there are certainly plenty of those around. Think, for example, about the CEO of a fossil fuel company. I'm going to call him he because he usually is a he, okay? So maybe this guy, one night he has a dream and a kind of revelation. He realizes, wow, this is a really dangerous situation. It's really important for us to shift as quickly as possible to renewable sources of energy. He wakes up in the morning, he's inspired. I realize this is kind of improbable, but think about it for a moment. What's he going to do? He's at the top. He's the CEO, right? But if the changes that he tries to make are going to reduce corporate profitability in any significant way, what's going to happen to him? Yeah, quickly. And he's the guy at the top. I mean, he has as much power as anybody does. Obviously, it's going to be pretty much the same all the way down the corporate pyramid of responsibility. You can see my point here. It's not simply a matter of individuals. The corporations are structured in a certain way. They're owned by all the people who own shares. The corporations have a responsibility to maximize profits. If they don't do that, they can be sued by the shareholders. What does this mean? It means that greed has become institutionalized and taken on a life of its own. And if we want to understand a lot of the resistance to the kinds of radical changes that are necessary in order to shift to renewable sources of energy and reduce our carbon emissions, I think that's a really important explanation right there. Does that make sense? What about the second poison? Ill will. My wife doesn't like it when I use that term, but I'm not sure what to say. It's not just anger. I guess you can say hatred, but there's a bunch of related terms that go along with ill will. What form, what collective and then institutionalized forms does our ill will take? I don't think that's very hard to think of, right? Racism. In particular right now, some of the ways that some people view undocumented immigrants, certain types of alternative types of sexual identity. There are certain forces that look at that quite negatively. But frankly, I think the best/worst example of institutionalized ill will is the world's militaries, if you think about it. And especially the United States military, remembering that we spend far more on our military than any other nation. I think something like the next 8 nations combined barely add up to the amount that we spend on our military, right? If we measure ill will by the amount spent on military, we are clearly the most militarized society in human history. I read, I think just yesterday, that our president, he who must not be named, has just decided that, or he's going to try to push it through Congress, that next year, for the first time, the official spending on military will be more than $1 trillion, 1.01 trillion. And it was kind of artificially pushed up to make some Republicans happy, something like that. Truly an astronomical sum. But actually it's been far more than $1 trillion for a long time. What most people don't know is that the Veterans Administration, which now spends about $350 billion a year, that's separate budget. And also the United States is planning to spend $1 trillion over the next 10 years to upgrade its nuclear arsenal. Put all that together, $100 billion here, $1 trillion there. Pretty soon you're talking real money, right? It adds up. Think what else we could do with that money. And if you spend that much money on your military, you're going to kind of have to use it once in a while to sort of justify it, don't you? We've been a militarized society since World War II, and increasingly so, despite the so-called peace dividend when the Soviet Union and the communist bloc broke apart. The second Iraq War, based on lies and propaganda, remember that? We had to go in and attack Iraq because of the They had these missiles. They were going to attack us. They could do it so quickly. All lies, lies. Anybody remember? A disaster, even as the war on terror has been making us all less secure, because every terrorist we kill or torture leaves so many grieving relatives who have this burning anger at us, outraged friends. Terrorism is something that can't be destroyed militarily because it's a tactic, right? It's not an enemy. And if terrorism is the war of the poor and disempowered, war, the kind of war that we wage, is the terrorism of the rich against the poor. It seems to me we need to find other ways to address those kinds of problems. The basic problem with war is that whether we're the good guys or the bad guys, it promotes and rationalizes the very worst part of ourselves. We're encouraged to kill, torture, brutalize other human beings. In one sense, maybe the most important sense, once a war begins, are there good guys and bad guys? Well, maybe sometimes, but not always. Sometimes it's just groups of people trying to hurt other groups of people. And I guess the basic Buddhist perspective there is that by brutalizing somebody else, we brutalize ourselves. To become the kind of person who brutalizes. The kind of behavior we'd never do by ourselves, except for a very small number who tend to get punished pretty severely for that. But in war, that kind of behavior is sanctioned. Always being justified as collective self-defense. We need to defend ourselves, don't we? Except that self-defense, national defense, can be used to rationalize almost anything, including torture and what's euphemistically called preventative war. By torture, I'm thinking of Guantanamo Bay, for example, in Cuba. And just because we ourselves are not the soldiers sent overseas to do the dirty work, doesn't mean that we remain innocent of the consequences of what our country does in our name. As Abraham Heschel used to say, some people are guilty, but all are responsible. Our society as a whole is responsible, and we are a part of that responsibility. Curious, isn't it, that our national self-defense requires us to have at least 737 overseas military installations. That's national self-defense, but we've got to have 737 installations overseas. That number's a bit old. It might be a little less, more likely a little more now. It turns out that in order to defend ourselves, we have to dominate the rest of the world. While we insist that other nations don't develop nuclear weapons, we spend huge amounts. Again, the old figure is $18 billion a year to keep our nuclear weapons up to date. But as I said not recently, we're decided we need to spend a lot more on that. Today, and again, this number is a couple years old now, but the all-world equivalent of nuclear bombs of all the nations, and remembering that the bombs we have now are much bigger than Hiroshima, much bigger than Nagasaki, right? Collectively, as of a few years ago, even after the reduction in nuclear arsenals that Russia and the US did, that figure a couple years ago was the equivalent of 135,000 Hiroshima bombs. 135,000 Hiroshima bombs. Think about that. In the US now, we still have approximately 5,000 nuclear warheads ready to go. Some are going to be taken out of, the agreement is to remove some of them, but that's been slow. At the moment, still have 5,000 nuclear warheads. Think about that. And 135,000, the equivalent Hiroshima bombs, if we or anyone used even 1% of that, civilization as we know it would not survive, right? So what's going on here? No matter how hard we try, no matter how many weapons we have, it seems like we can never feel secure enough, like a paranoid dictator. Just like our GNP can never be big enough. In some, our huge military industrial complex, I guess it's not just the military, it's the military industrial complex, right? That's how we have institutionalized our ill will, a kind of a collective negativity that's taken on a life of its own, with the self-reinforcing logic that may lead to our mutual destruction. And the other thing we need to add to that, of course, just like on the individual level, my greed and my personal ill will, they kind of reinforce each other. They work together, right? If you get in the way of my greed, what I want, well, maybe there's going to be negative feelings and something going on there. Well, likewise, what's going on in the military? Why do we have this bloated military, which nonetheless is never big enough? Something else we have to remember is that many of the top generals and admirals, when they finally retire, guess what? They get jobs with the major corporations that provide weapons and the jets and the ships, right? They move into these positions just waiting for them. And of course, they wouldn't be able to move into those positions if they had been really tough in the procurement process, right? If they had actually challenged the inflated prices, maybe those jobs wouldn't be waiting for them at the end. But you can see the point, right? Institutionalized greed and institutionalized ill will, they work kind of well together too, don't they? And what about institutionalized delusion? The Buddha literally means the awakened one, which implies that to some degree the rest of us are not awakened, at least not until we're pretty far along, presumably on the Buddhist path, right? What seems to be built into that, the idea, we're deluded, we don't really understand, or you could say each of us lives in kind of a bubble of our own delusions of self and separation. A bubble of delusion. But we also dwell together within a much bigger bubble that largely determines how we collectively understand the world as well as ourselves. And interestingly, the institution most responsible for molding this collective sense of self is the media. There was a time when a lot of that would have referred to print media. Well, I guess it still does to some degree, but what about books? I read somewhere recently that a third of American adults, their functional reading level is third grade. I wonder how many books a year they read. I wonder how many Americans actually read one book a year. Especially with the temptations of the digital media. reading, especially when you're not really proficient, that's hard work. How much more fun, how easier to look at screens, right? Internet, well, television too. Got to mention Fox News here somewhere, right? There was a time when there was a fairness doctrine, when media were required to offer sort of a balanced account, but once cable came in, that's no longer the case, right? So Fox News can claim it's fair and balanced, but it doesn't really have to do anything to support that. Not that Fox News is the only problem here, right? You could say that the media have become a kind of collective nervous system. Genuine democracy requires an independent and activist press media to expose abuse and discuss political issues. But in the process of becoming mega corporations, the major media have abandoned all pretense of objectivity. And the other thing to remember is, except for PBS, public radio, public television, the media are private corporations. Here we go, another interaction. They're private corporation, which is to say they are trying to make money. That's their responsibility to the people who own the shares, right? I find it interesting. They're dependent on advertising. They're never going to offer a critique of consumerism. On the contrary, they are playing a vital role in advertising and keeping us defining ourselves as consumers. That's our identity. An important part of genuine education is realizing that many of the things that we tend to take for granted, in fact, are conditioned, culturally, historically conditioned, and they could be changed. The world doesn't have to be the way it is. There are many other possibilities. But the present role of the major media is to foreclose those possibilities, to confine public discourse within a very narrow band of what's acceptable, right? So Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, right? He's a socialist. He calls himself a socialist? Oh, come on. How did he get into the Senate? What's going on here? Obviously, this is beyond the pale. This should not be tolerated. Obviously, anything he says, he's a leftist extremist. This is ridiculous. We don't have to pay attention to what he says, right? Our societies are now dominated by a power elite composed of governments and large corporations, including major media, and they go back and forth. The rich, powerful people in this country, for example, they can go back and forth from their corporations, from the media into the government, and come back again because they have the same value system. There's little difference in their worldview or their goals, which are primarily economic expansion. Politics remains what John Dewey called the shadow cast by big business over society. There was a very interesting study by some academics that looked at Congress and the bills that were passed. A very important study, and it basically concluded that what most people wanted made virtually no difference. In terms of what actually happened in Congress, it was what the corporations and the rich people wanted that passed and happened. And if I'm quite frank, I don't really believe we're a democracy anymore. Maybe it's important to shed that illusion. Yes, we still have democratic forms, but if you consider the extraordinary amount of money that the Supreme Court now allows people, campaigns, to devote to manipulating our opinion, inevitably distorting it, right? They largely control the media. Remember how it was that Washington Post and the LA Times, the billionaire owners didn't allow them to endorse Kamala Harris for, remember? Yeah, what's going on there, right? And how many millions of dollars did Elon Musk spend trying to, well, first of all, to get Trump elected, but also in Wisconsin, fortunately it didn't work there, but we get the idea. Let's be honest, a lot of the times it does work. Again, we see how these three, right? Institutionalized greed, corporate system, institutionalized militarism, institutionalized delusion, how it is that they work together. The role of media in this unholy alliance is to normalize this situation so that we accept it and continue to perform our roles as workers and consumers. Aldous Huxley once observed, the propagandist's purpose is to make one set of people forget that certain other sets of people are human. Seems to me a lot of that is going on right now. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene told a gathering of young people in Texas that her Democratic colleagues in Congress are, quote, kind of night creatures like witches and vampires and ghouls. Let's demonize them before we what to them. The core QAnon theory, conspiracy theory, is that a cabal of satanic, cannibalistic sexual abusers of children are operating a global child sex trafficking ring. It's pretty crazy. But an NPR Ipsos poll found that 1 in 5 Americans believes it. Believe the following statement is true. Quote, a group of Satan-worshipping elites who run a child sex ring are trying to control our politics and media. 1 in 5 Americans projects to roughly 36 million adults. Another 37% aren't sure whether the allegations are completely false. Folks, we've got a problem, right? And it's not just Trump, but what are the collective ways of thinking that have created someone like him? And if it's not him, will it be somebody else? Right. According to the Buddha, samsara isn't just a world of suffering, it's a world of delusion, because delusions are at the root of our suffering. That includes collective fantasies, I think, like the necessity of consumerism today and perpetual economic growth, which requires collective repression, such as denial of climate change. It seems to me that today, realizing the true nature of these three institutionalized poisons, these three institutionalized unwholesome roots, is just as important as any personal realization that we might have as a result of our personal practice into our own greed, ill will, delusion. In fact, I would say that any individual awakening that we may have remains incomplete until it is supplemented by this social awakening or collective awakening. Usually we think of expanded consciousness in individual terms, but today we have to dispel, to challenge this bubble of group delusion. And to conclude, it seems to me that if what I'm saying is true, that indeed today greed, ill will, delusion have become institutionalized and taken on a life of their own, it's difficult for me to avoid the conclusion that just as dealing with my own individual greed, ill will, delusion is my spiritual path, can we say then that not just the ecological crisis, but what we're now calling the poly crisis, such as I partly presented today, it seems to me it's important to acknowledge that they're not just economic, political, psychological, technological problem, that what we're facing is also a spiritual challenge. Just as our individual path is a spiritual challenge, likewise this addressing, finding ways to address with this collective problem is also a spiritual problem, which therefore calls for a response that must also have a spiritual component. And of course that's what Buddhism does, the Bodhisattva path.